More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 8. Vindonissa. One day I saw the wife watering the indoor plants at her house, and she was using a strangely shaped old copper watering can. It had an oval-shaped bottom, a thin handle over the top to hold it be, and a long thin spout. There was only half a lid, so you could fill it with water. I asked her where she had found such a thing. "I have known it since I was a child, and it has always been with me," she said. "It was made by inmates in a lunatic asylum." I assumed there must be a story to this, and she readily agreed. "But it's a rather long story," she added. "Let me tell it to you over tea later on." In the late afternoon, I got ready the teapot and laid the table out on the patio with the tea things. A slight breeze stirred the blooming roses in the garden and brought their scent over. The hum of bees could be heard from the swaying lavender bush nearby. We sat down to tea, and as promised, Elisabeth began her tale of the watering can from the lunatic asylum. I'll try to retell it as best I remember it. I should preface it by explaining that Elisabeth lost her father when she was only 4. She grew up in rather straitened circumstances after that. She and her mother lived in Bern. Holidays needed careful planning and budgeting, and so her mother was pleased when her relatives, Uncle Erwin and Tante Mädeli, invited them to come for a couple of weeks and stay with them at Koenigsfelden, which, as everyone in Switzerland knows, is a lunatic asylum built in the late 19th century. Today it is known more euphemistically as a psychiatric clinic, but when it was built, it served the main purpose of keeping lunatics from escaping and bothering the local populace. Now, Uncle Erwin and Tante Mädeli were not themselves lunatics, of course. He was a woodworking and handicrafts teacher by training, and he had a job at the asylum providing what would now be called occupational therapy to the lunatics, at least to those who were amenable. The area around the asylum, which is near the town of Brugg, is steeped in history. This area is known as Vindisch, or Vindonissa in Latin, and it is one of the places in this country that was settled by the Romans. It was the midsummer in 1957 when Elisabeth and her mother travelled there. Elisabeth was 9 years old. On the train to Brugg, her mother warned her, "You'll see strange people there, but never mind them." Uncle Erwin met them at the station and took them across the area known as Vindonissa to the asylum, driving in one of the official cars belonging to the institution. The asylum building was grey and forbidding, but Uncle Erwin explained that he and his wife lived in the same residential building as the doctors. It was a dépendance off to one side of the main building. Uncle Erwin parked the car in the garage, then took their luggage and accompanied them into the asylum. He was a quiet, self-possessed, but jovial man. He took them across the inner courtyard, towards the low residential building apart from the main asylum. Gradually, they got the strange feeling of being watched. They looked up, and sure enough, there were faces at the barred windows all around. They pointed at the new arrivals. The women began screaming at them. The men at other windows shouted curses. Them were the days, of course, before there was any therapeutic drugs in asylums. And so the lunatics, if they wanted to scream and shout, were just left to scream and shout. Elisabeth was horrified at the angry, distorted faces and the staring eyes she glimpsed behind the bars. "Never mind them," said Uncle Irwin matter-of-factly. "They always get excited when someone new appears. Those are what we call the hopeless cases. You can't do anything except confine them. They scream and yell all day, and sometimes all night too. They're not the ones I get. Only the docile ones are sent to me. And some of those hopeless cases have been here for longer than any of us. There's some really peculiar ones live in a world of their own making. Like, there's one thinks he's Napoleon. Another thinks he's Julius Caesar. One of the women thinks she's the Virgin Mary." He chuckled. "I'm well used to them. So are we all. When they get going sometimes, you'd think it was carnival." He chuckled again. By this time they were out of the courtyard. In spite of Uncle Irwin's assurances, the visitors were glad to escape from the screaming, cursing lunatics around the asylum's barred windows. When they got to the dépendance, Tante Madeley was waiting to welcome them. She too was a jovial woman, but not marked by her husband's quietness. The lunatics didn't seem to bother her at all. They lived in an apartment on the ground floor. Elisabeth was given a little room of her own, her mother the larger room next to it. Elisabeth's room was in fact at one end of the residential building, and through her window she looked out on the open country of Vindonissa, and off to one side she could see a church. It was explained to her that that had been the monastery church in the days when there was a monastery on the site. The first night there, Elisabeth slept reasonably well, reassured by the fact that her mother was in the next room, though she did wake up once or twice, hearing blood-curdling screams from somewhere in the asylum. The following nights were the same. They spent the days explored in the local countryside. Elisabeth's mother talked with Tante Madeley. Uncle Irwin was usually busy with his class. Tante Madeley took the visitors to look in on him one morning. Now here there was no screaming or cursing, Elisabeth was relieved to discover. Yet the lunatics were not exactly friendly or welcoming. They looked at them with sullen, expressionless eyes, and some seemed to withdraw into themselves and cower as if in fear. Tante Madeley explained afterwards that Uncle Irwin was teaching them to make things out of copper, as that was an easy material to work with. That night, the third night, Elisabeth slept soundly until she was awakened by a noise. She sat up in bed and listened. It sounded like marching feet. It was coming closer. She got up, opened the window, and looked out on the summer night. A marching line of people was approaching across the courtyard and heading in the direction of the old church. Above the measured tread, she began to hear other sounds, like screams or laughs or catcalls. The lunatics were awake, watching the procession. Then it came into her view. First was a man on a horse. He wore a plumed helmet and a long red cloak. He was also wearing some kind of metal armour. He was followed by a group of marching men with similar helmets, but carrying spears and long shields. They too were all wearing some kind of armour. Could this be Julius Caesar, the hopeless madman? Wondered Elisabeth. Had he got a whole crowd of lunatics to dress up in these red cloaks and helmets and follow him around? What if they escaped? Wasn't anyone going to stop them? One of the doctors at least. She imagined white-coated figures running out the doors of the dépendance and ordering the lunatics back into the asylum. But there was no intervention. The men marched past, 2 or 3 abreast, and disappeared beyond the old church. All was now still. Elisabeth, confused and wearied by the spectacle, climbed back into bed and fell asleep. The next morning she told her mother and Tante Madeley about what she'd seen in the night. "Was that Julius Caesar, the madman Uncle Erwin talks about?" she asked. Tante Madeley laughed. "No, child," she said. "He and his kind can't get out. That's the whole point." Her mother looked worried, though. "I hope the lunatics are not upsetting you," she said. "I can't help it if I see them out at night," Elisabeth replied. Her mother just shook her head and said, "You dreamed it." That was the end of the matter for the time being. The following night, young Elisabeth was so keyed up that she didn't even expect to sleep. But sleep she did, until sometime after midnight. She awoke to hear sounds. She got up and went to the window. She could see there were lights in the church across the way. She heard confused sounds of weeping and wailing. They came from over there, she could tell, for the summer night was very still. She peered into the darkness and saw several human figures walk into the church. There were several men, 4 of whom were carrying something on their shoulders. It looked like a funeral bier. They were followed by another figure, a woman in a long dark cloak. She was the one who was weeping and wailing. The doors of the church were flung open, and a strange flickering light streamed out on the procession. Then they all went into the church. She heard no more. Elisabeth felt something like fear, but an even greater curiosity to see what these lunatics were doing in the dead of night, in spite of what Tante Madeley might believe. She thought of the procession and the lamenting woman, and inevitably she thought of Good Friday. Could this woman be the one who thought she was the Virgin Mary? Filled with these wondering thoughts, Elisabeth slipped her coat on over her nightdress, put on her shoes, and slipped out of her room. She found her way down the hall in the darkness, and stealthily opened the front door, so she made no sound that might awaken the family. She was now out in the courtyard. It was not cold, but she shivered. Then she walked across in the direction of the church. She came to the door, both halves of which were open, and the light that came out was that flickering light she had seen. When she went inside, she knew why. The light was coming from flaming torches, set at regular intervals along the walls. She had been to see the church in the daytime, but they'd gone there to admire the stained glass windows, which Uncle Erwin said were very fine and very old. She walked up the nave, her shoes making a sound that seemed to echo through the church. She walked onwards till she came to the centre of the nave, behind which she knew was the crypt. In front of it was a sort of catafalque, and on the catafalque was a bier, and on the bier was a dead man. He was wearing what seemed to be blood-stained clothes. He was bearded and dark-haired. Elisabeth came close and looked down at his face as if hypnotised. Who was this man? He was not old. She thought of the photograph of her dead father, the one she kept, the only one that was left. She looked into the man's eyes, half expecting a response, but the eyes were dead and fixed and staring. He lay on his back on the bier in his blood-stained clothes and his leather riding boots. Laid on his chest was a sword, pointing towards his feet, and his hands had been clasped around the jewelled hilt. The hands were very white. He was very dead. Up on the roof, a bell had begun to toll. Elisabeth looked up and saw the woman she had seen earlier, sitting at the head of the bier, her dark blue cloak gathered around her. Her long brown hair was brushed back from her face and enclosed in a headband ornamented with threads of gold. Their eyes met. So this was one of the hopeless cases Uncle Irvin had talked about. The woman looked very sad, sadder even than the people in Uncle Irvin's handicrafts group. She spoke. "Have you come to mourn him?" she asked. Elisabeth didn't know what to say. She was expected to know who this man was, but she didn't. Had one of the patients died during the day? Or been murdered by another? She hadn't heard any such thing. But perhaps things went on here in the night time that were not talked about the next day. Not really knowing what to say, she looked down at the dead man again. "What is your name?" the woman asked, more quietly now. "Elisabeth," she replied. "It is well," said the woman. "I too am Elisabeth." "Who is he?" asked the girl now. "You do not know?" the woman said incredulously. "He is my husband, Albrecht." "What made him die?" "Parricide, assassins," exclaimed the woman. "Struck down by the daggers of his own flesh and blood. But there will be justice," she went on, placing her right hand over the man's hands on the ornamented hilt of the sword. "I have sworn it." "I must go now," said Elisabeth to the woman, who had raised her eyes and was looking across the stiff corpse at her. "My father is dead too," she added. "Can you not watch with me but one little hour?" asked the woman sadly. "No," said Elisabeth, shaking her head slowly. "It is night, and I must sleep." "He sleeps, and sleeps well, for he will never awaken," said the woman in the same sad voice. She looked at Elisabeth again. "Go then, and sleep." Elisabeth hesitated. "I will come again and keep you company in the night time, if you are still here." "I am always here," the woman said. "I will always be here." She bowed her head. Elisabeth turned and walked down the nave under the flickering lights of the torches. She walked out the open door of the church without looking back. In the morning, she told herself it was a dream, but she knew it was not. She wanted to tell the others about this hopeless case she had met, confined here for always as it seemed, but she didn't want to alarm her mother, so she said nothing. Meanwhile, the holidays were going by, and it would soon be time for Elisabeth and her mother to travel back to Bern. It was quiet at night now, except for one night shortly before their departure. Elisabeth awoke to hear faint singing. She got up and went to the window, throwing it wide. The sound of men's voices came faintly from the church. And yes, they were singing. The lights were on in the church and the doors were wide. Now a procession of men, 2 or 3 abreast, came out of the church, some holding flaming torches, and a group of them carrying the bier with the corpse on it. They all wore dark cloaks that had hoods, which they had drawn over their heads as if to hide their faces. They sang their song in chorus, and the sound of it was strangely monotonous, but the procession disappeared out into the countryside, and the sound of singing faded too. Elisabeth went back to sleep. The night before they were to go, Elisabeth looked out at night for the last time. The lights were on in the church. The doors were open. She remembered her promise to the woman, who was also called Elisabeth. With a sudden resolve, she put on her coat and walked across to the old church. She went in, and again there were torches along the walls to give light. She walked slowly up the nave, not sure if she was dreaming. The woman in the blue cloak was waiting where she had been before, standing this time. The bier and the corpse over which she had kept vigil were gone. Elisabeth stopped a little way from her and said, "I have come to keep you company, as I promised." The woman nodded. A bell began to toll overhead. "Blood will have blood," she said. "Blood will have blood. Justice has been done on my husband's killers. He is avenged, and well avenged. He can sleep easy now in his grave." She paused. "But blood will have blood, again and again. Once it starts, it cannot stop. The death and doom and bloodletting. Come, Elisabeth, you who have been given my name. Come and I will show you all that has happened." So saying, and beckoning to the young girl, the woman turned and went to the head of the stone stairs leading down into the crypt. She began descending the stairs, holding her skirts in her left hand as she did so. Elisabeth followed, overcome by curiosity and by sympathy for the widow. She picked her way carefully down the stone steps. Here the only light was from the torches on the walls high above. The woman paused in the middle of the floor of the crypt and turned to face her. "Elisabeth," she said, "blood will have blood, and it will always have blood. I took my revenge on my husband's killers, but once you set vengeance in motion, it does not stop. It goes on and on. I have a hand in all of this." She stretched out her arms, pointing to the walls of the crypt all around them. "Look," she said. Elisabeth looked. At first, the flickering light from above only lit up what seemed to be crude and patchy stone walls. But then she began to see depth in them and see a pattern. Yes, a pattern that she did not want to see. For on every side was a wall of bones piled on bones, and in any gap left in the piles was a row of grinning skulls. Elisabeth cried out in horror when she saw the contents of the charnel house all around her, with the remains of what seemed like 100 dead men. She turned and ran up the stone steps. At the top, she paused to catch her breath, and then she ran headlong down the nave and out the doors. Her footfalls echoed all around the empty church. Once in the open, she hurried back to the house. She let herself in and crept, panting, to her room. She was just relieved to get into bed under the covers. Soon she was asleep. When she awoke in the morning, there was packing to do, and Tante Madeley made them a lunch to take with them on the train. Uncle Erwin presented them with a parting gift. It was a copper watering can. "My lunatics made it for you," he said. "Something to remember us by." They followed Uncle Erwin across the asylum courtyard to the garages as he carried their luggage. Again the screams and curses from the barred windows above, but it didn't shock them so much this time. Uncle Erwin drove him to the station, and they went home. "That is how I got the watering can," said Elisabeth, pointing to it in the window. "It was shiny when we got it, but that was, all of 60 years ago. It has blackened in the meantime, but I still have it to water my plants." "Was that the only time you were there?" I asked. "Have you ever been back?" She shook her head. "No, not since 1957. "We should go there on a day trip," I said. "I, for one, would like to see the place. Maybe we can find the meaning of some of these strange things you saw there." "Yes," she said. "Let's go there one day." And so we did. We took the train from Bâle to Brugg and walked across the countryside of Vindonissa. There were all kinds of Roman ruins to be seen. It had been a garrison town on the way to the German province. Elisabeth's guidebook to the antiquities of Switzerland, which we had brought with us, said that The 13th Legion was stationed there. "Don't you see?" I said to her. "Those were the marching men you saw, and no lunatics at all." We went on to the asylum of Koenigsfelden. Now it is called euphemistically the psychiatric clinic. It's still a forbidding grey building. "There was a great to-do in the papers a while ago," Elisabeth remarked. "A murderer was being held there, and he managed to escape." We didn't venture into the place, but around to the side we found the old church of Königsfelden. The guidebook said that the monastery was closed down at the time of the Reformation and abandoned, though the church still stands. The clinic was built on the site of the old monastery. "Perhaps it incorporates the fabric of the old building," I said. "So that is why you saw monks coming in procession out of the church. They were chanting plain song." She nodded. "Those were no madmen either," she said. "According to the guidebook," I went on, reading out loud, "the monastery was endowed by Queen Elisabeth of Görz and Tyrol. She did so in memory of her husband, King Albrecht of Hapsburg, for the Hapsburgs came from this area originally. Albrecht had been waylaid and murdered as he was crossing the river Reuss near here. The murderers were his nephew, Johann, forever after known as the Parricide, and some others of the local nobility. It happened on the 1st of May, 1308. By this time, we had reached the old church and went in. As the guidebook explained, it was famous for its stained glass windows. We walked up the nave, and on one side we saw an elaborate wooden structure with names and likenesses of knights painted on it. I looked for an explanation in the guidebook. "These knights are those who fell on the Habsburg side at the Battle of Sempach in 1386. They were led by Rudolf of Hapsburg, the grandson of King Albrecht and Queen Elisabeth. The Habsburgs were defeated by the Swiss Confederates at Sempach, and great was the slaughter of knights, including Rudolf of Hapsburg himself. That was the beginning of the end for the Habsburgs in Switzerland, it seems. After the battle, the remains of Rudolf and his knights were transported here and buried down in the crypt. The bones were later all removed to Austria and replaced by the monument up here." Elisabeth was standing in the centre of the nave, not far from the stone steps leading down into the crypt. "Here is where it was," she said suddenly. "Here lay the bier on the catafalque, with the body of the dead man holding his sword. And behind it stood the woman who called herself Elisabeth, mourning her husband and the father of her children." I consulted the guidebook again. "It says here that Elisabeth of Görz and Tyrol was a fury, taking vengeance on their nephew Johann, called the Parricide, and his associates. As reigning queen, she had them hunted down and captured, although they'd all taken flight after the murder. Anyway, they were tried for murder and condemned to be broken on the wheel. Only Johann escaped and took refuge in an Italian monastery, where he died shortly afterwards. Once her vengeance was taken, Elisabeth turned to care for the soul of her murdered husband. She endowed a new monastery on the site near where Albrecht had been struck down, at Vindonissa, where the Romans had had their camp. The monastery became known as Königsfelden, the King's Fields. It was run by Franciscans." I paused and looked at Elisabeth. They were the ones you saw chanting as they left the church in procession. Elisabeth nodded. She stood lost in thought, remembering the distraught queen, hell-bent on vengeance, and the murdered king on his bier. "Shall we go down into the crypt?" I asked. I was not at all sure she would say yes, but she nodded again, and we went down the stone stairs. The crypt was empty. There were just bare stone walls you could make out in the dim light coming down from above. We looked around in silence. Here all the bones were piled up. Duke Rudolph and his knights. Even Queen Elizabeth was buried here, it seems, I remarked. They're all long gone now. I was interrupted by a loud groan from Elizabeth. Why all this killing? She exclaimed. Why? Then she turned to me. We must leave this place, she told me. I can take no more. Rapidly we ascended the stone steps, walked down the nave and out the door. We sat down on a rustic bench outside in the sun. Elizabeth was weeping bitter tears. After a while, she recovered herself and looked up at me. Now I know what I saw here as a child so many years ago, she said with a sigh. It was no dream, and it was no play acting. I saw the 13th Legion marching into Vindonissa. I saw and heard the monks of the monastery. And I saw the Queen mourning her murdered husband and revelling in her never-ending revenge. She chuckled bitterly now. And all the time I took it for a midnight carnival of lunatics. You have been listening to Vindonissa by Turlough Conmee from More Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and comment. And so, until next time.